Thank you for that. Here's a card. Read a card from Sheila. Thank you so much for being there for me. You are angels and you are a blessing. Love, Sheila. My next to the oldest sister, who is actually my oldest living sister now, she is 89. She'll be 90 in a few weeks. And many, many years ago, she had cancer. And she knew that and found out about that and thought, well, she will go and be operated on. And so after she found out and made the appointment and all of that, they started praying. And I'm not sure how long between the time they started praying before come time to go to the hospital. But anyway, at one point in there, she said, well, God healed me, so there is no real need for me to go through the surgery. And so to make a long story short, the doctor said, well, it'd probably be best if we just go ahead and do the surgery anyway. And she said, well, I don't really need the surgery. I don't think I do. I believe God has healed me. And so she said, well, but if you think you ought to do the surgery, then we'll just go ahead. And so after they were in there, he was in there looking around for the cancer, he couldn't find anything. And so I guess they just sewed her back up. And so he said, well, when I got in there, I didn't find anything. And she said, well, I told you you wasn't going to find anything before you done the surgery. And so she wrote a big page about like this. And it's her testimony. And that had to be 60 some years ago. And she'll be 90 in a few weeks. And she's still puttering around and calls me often and still of sound mind and still reminds me how God touched her and sort of turned things around. And so things like that have happened along the way, I learned early on to believe in healing and the power of God to heal. There's a passage, actually a lectionary passage from Luke chapter 6, verses 17 to 26, and the title of it is Jesus Teaches and Heals. There is 3 verses I want us to look very, very close at. Luke chapter 6, verse 17, 18, and 19. There's 2 other parts to this passage. The second part is blessings and woes. So there is blessings in there, 4 blessings. And then there is some woes towards the end, and we know what it means when the Bible talks about woe. But anyway, this passage in Luke chapter 6, verse 17, 18, and 19. This little passage here Some call it the Sermon on the Plain. You know, in Matthew 5 through 7, we got the Sermon on the Mount. Well, Matthew 6, 17, 18, and 19 has been labeled by some as the Sermon on the Plain. I'd spent a lot of time just on these 3 verses because of the wording, and there was some interesting things, and it also talks about the power of God. Starting at verse 17, Luke 6:17, and in Luke, these 17 and 18, 19 here is right after Jesus had been on the mountain all night praying, and then he comes down and he chooses the 12 apostles. And in Luke, this Sermon on the Plain is right behind that. Verse 17 says, he came down with them and stood on a level place. That word level there, I looked at a lot of different places, and some offered the word plain, P-L-A-I-N. And anyway, there was a lot of information on the actual word choice when it says, he came down with them and stood on a level plain. So anyway, this passage is the Sermon on the Plain. Notice, as we look on at verse 17, it says, with a great crowd, well, I'll just go back to the front. He came down with them, the apostles, and stood on the level place, or the level plain, with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people. So a great crowd of his disciples, and they said that this was not just talking about the 12 apostles, but more of disciples or people who had decided to follow Jesus, and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. So those 4 particular places, Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. And the Tyre and Sidon were 2 seaside pagan cities. So evidently, a lot of people from those 2 seaside pagan cities, there was a good piece from the Judea and Jerusalem crew. So people had come a long way, whether they had heard what was going on, or it was interesting to try to figure out why pagans from 2 particular cities would come down just to hear what Jesus was saying. But anyway, with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. The Sermon on the Plain. Verse 18 says, they had come, and then it gives 2 reasons. 2 reasons. They had come to hear him, the first one, and to be healed of their diseases. And then Luke splits up, and he says, the first one was, they came to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. So the unclean spirits they associated with demons and demonic spirits. So 2 different needs in this passage from healing: diseases and the trouble with the unclean spirits. So evidently there was a lot of people, and that has become significant in the next verse, but a lot of people came to hear what Jesus was saying and to witness the miracles that had been happening. 19 says, and all in the crowd were trying to touch him. The people from these 4 different places who heard what Jesus was doing, they evidently thought it was very, very important just to be able to try to get to him and to touch him, if they could just touch him. And then the reason for that, for power came out from him. Power came out from him. So I pictured in my own mind, not in this right here, but whether Jesus was sitting or whether he was standing, and all of this multitude of people was around him to hear him, the power of God must have been oozing out of him. And that is what says the power came out from him and healed. And then that little word in there, I'm sure all meant all 2,000 years ago, like all means all now. And it says, for power came out from him and healed all of them. A-L-L, all of them. The word power in that 19th verse, it was interesting because as I was going from different place to place, one place it said, for virtue came out from him and healed all of them. And so I have an old Thompson Chain Reference Bible that I've had for a long time, and it's coming apart, and it's the old Thompson Chain King James version of the Bible. And so I got it off of the shelf and I opened it up to Luke 6, verse 19, because there was a lot of talk about for power came out from him. And I looked in the old Thompson Chain Reference Bible, and it said, it didn't say for power came out from him, it said for healing virtue came out from him. And I thought that makes perfect sense. Healing virtue came out from him and healed them all. Someone said, the ones who were willing to receive the healing were healed. Not necessarily the ones who didn't want to be healed or didn't want anything to do with it. Maybe they didn't understand it, or they just didn't want anything to do with it. 19, all in the crowd were trying to touch him. For power or healing virtue came out from him and healed all of them. I know and believe that God still heals, as he did for my sister many, many years ago, as he has done in the past from our kids, a whole lot of different situations where we just had to say, well, had to be God, do it. But I found it interesting that this little 3-verse Sermon on the Plain would be put in that spot for one of the scripture texts for the lectionary of all things. The healing on the plain. I found one thing that helped me to understand these verses better and to sort of personalize it for me, of a segment in Eugene Peterson's book, not the one book where he translated the Bible. This one's called Conversations, where when he's sitting and he was translated and whatever. This is just another part of it that he he just sort of gleaned from it and from this particular passage in Luke chapter 6. And I'm going to read that, and this is from his book. There's no evidence that Jesus was a morose person or grumpy. No evidence that Jesus was a grumpy person to be with. The data tells us that he was pleasant to be with, that his associates were often lifted to higher spirits, walked on lighter air, and smiled more often because of his companionship. So why then this glorification of the weeping? Right after the Sermon on the Plain, there is some blessed are you. Blessed are you. There's 4 of them, I believe. And they say that Matthew chapter 5 through 7, and this is sort of Luke's take on the Sermon on the Mount and all the blessings. So there's 4 of them here. It says, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. And it goes down and it gives 4 blessings. And then after that, those 4 beatitudes, there are, I think, 4 woes. Verse 24, but woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. 25, woe to you who are full. And I notice another word there, interesting, in verse 25, says, woe to you who are full now. Like now. Several different times, the word now is the last part of the verse. The second part of verse 25, woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. So what he's trying to connect this Sermon on the Plain about God's healing, and then these beatitudes, these blessings, and then the woes. But the part I want to talk about is the healing power that came out of God. Twice we're told in the Gospels that Jesus wept. Once when he approached Jerusalem and wept because the city didn't respond to God's love. A second time when Lazarus died. Both times we know that Jesus had taken upon his own heart the despairing unbelief and the troubled souls of those he loved, and grief overwhelmed him. Weeping for Jesus was not from depression or personal pain or feeling sorry for himself. It was entirely associated with the needs of others. Weeping was a form of intercession, a sympathetic entering into the pain of others. But weeping will follow by joy. So his enlightenment for me, the part that meant huge to me at this time in my life, was connecting that Jesus heals with the power coming out from him, and he healed them all. So for me, the connection was, he says, weeping was a form of intercession, a sympathetic entering into the pain of others. So when I stand and watch kids and grandkids, knowing that they are hurting, they can't figure out what in the world is going on or why. So they're in pain, and they have the look of despair and confusion on their face. not because of anything they done. It makes me grieve and hurt on the inside for them. So what I do is, this is just another way for me to pray. And I can ask God, and all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. So what I'm doing now is asking for healing for all of them. Emotional healing. I know that things like this happen all the time. And it's happened, I'm sure, of someone you know. So I'm talking mainly to myself, because I know exactly the power of prayer and what prayer can do. God still heals in 2022, just like he did 2,000 years ago. And so I can ask God to touch them. And help them to make it through to the other side. God didn't promise that there would not be any hardships. What he promised was he would walk through or with us through them. He promised to walk through them with us, beside us, like you just sung. He's the one who feeds the sparrow. This says, but weeping will be followed with joy. The marks of joy are stamped all over the Christian life. The people of God are a laughing people. But it isn't uninterrupted laughter. There are times of excruciating pain and sorrow that we experience in the world around us. And if there's not enough love in us, enough concern to involve ourselves with people in their need, enough concern to bring tears to our eyes and heaviness to our hearts, our laughter will be a very hollow affair and will end in eternal weeping. So I learned something very good the past few days, and it will be a more effective way for me to pray. As I enter into the pain of others, and I'll admit, right here in the pulpit on Sunday morning, sometimes I become not a very happy person. As a result. But I can't change anything, but I can sure pray and talk to a God that I know hears and answers prayer according to his riches in glory. So if any of you, hopefully nobody is, if you need something like this along the way, it's just 3 little verses in Luke chapter 6, but it says a whole lot about what God can do. I've been thinking with this, 1 Samuel chapter 17, you know, where it talks about David. Only a boy named David, only a rippling brook, only a boy named David, 5 little stones he took. 1 little stone went in the sling, and the sling went round and round. And we know what happened. That stone sunk right in the old boy's temple as he dropped to the ground. You see, that is the God. That's who He is. That's the God we live for and serve. Stand with me, if you will, and let's sing our song.